You're looking at the lesson sheets. We're in lesson 9. We've been talking about surrendering our lives over to in service to God, and we spent a couple of weeks, and because of our gospel meeting in the middle of all that, it kind of broke up that lesson 8 a little bit. But we talked in that particular lesson about the idea of surrendering to purpose. This lesson, lesson 9, deals with the idea of recognizing that it's what kind of commitment? Long term, right? This is a long-term commitment. Our life in service to God isn't a momentary, instantaneous kind of thing. We're in a long-term commitment. And the author really spent, and I'm not going to go through every piece of what he did here in these first 4 or 5 paragraphs. I think we can kind of make the point and move on. But basically, he illustrated to us that what kind of world do we live in? Fast, right? An instant gratification, right? We live in a fast world where we have done anything and everything we can do to try to speed things up. Gone are the days where you chase your own chicken down, right, and go ahead and butcher it up and cook it. We stop at good old Colonel Sanders and we get us a bucket, and who knows whether it's chicken or not. I'll get sued on the camera. Never mind. I didn't mean that. It's a joke. Forget I'm live sometime. My bad. But anyway, you get it, right? We don't do it that way anymore. I mean, I've often believed that if you could create a fast food joint that could know what you wanted, well, you can actually. They can know what you want before you actually get there nowadays with apps and things like that. Won't be long before they just chuck it out the window at you as you drive by at 60 miles an hour, and you'll be on your merry way, because that's kind of the way we like things. You know, it used to be if you wanted to cook something, you'd have to build a fire and let that heat up, but nowadays, fire wasn't good enough. Then we got gas and electric stoves, and now we put it in that nuclear weapon that's sitting on the counter, and we heat it up, and we do things as quick and as fast as possible. I always illustrate that with popcorn, because it used to be, you can remember when you had to sit there, and anybody remember shaking that popcorn in that pot on the stove and sit there and shake it. Now we stare at that window of that microwave just waiting for that instant gratification. The point is very simple that he's making here. Because our world is fast and we want things to happen immediately, we might be tempted to think that our relationship to God can be viewed in the same kind of thought. And it's not going to work that way. Our commitment to God isn't just an instantaneous moment. It isn't, and in that growth process in relationship to Him isn't going to come as quickly at times as we would like it to. It is a long-term commitment that's going to take time, energy, and effort along the path. And with that, it's going to take what? And that's where Galatians 6 comes into the picture, by the way. It's going to take patience, but what else according to that text? It's going to take, well, what's he say? If a man be overtaken in the fault, ye which are spiritual, it's going to take then help. It's going to take help. It's going to take other people aiding and assisting me along the way. The whole point of Galatians 6 is to illustrate how this relationship that we have to God may be personal in the sense of judgment. It's personal in the sense of my conviction that I need to have and responsibilities that I have in relationship to it. We'll talk about that out of this narrative before we're done. But it also is a recognition that along the path we're going to need some help, some aid, some assistance along the way. People educating, encouraging, rebuking at times, maybe even reproving, whatever's necessary in order to help me maintain this long-term relationship. And because of that, and because of the nature of the fact that we're dealing with eternal kinds of promises, we're dealing with things that are issues of eternity, not the immediate temporary that we live in, then they should bear for us an even greater level of importance and a lifetime worth of commitment unto our Father. And sometimes we forget that God wants that out of us. All right, any thoughts, questions? I think we get that point. I don't want to belabor All right, so let's just jump into the text. The first time in a long time. I just get to the point, right, Ryan? Just get to the text that's under discussion for us tonight. We're in Galatians chapter 6, and we're going to just start in verse 1 and start working our way through this text together this evening, because there's twofold kinds of conversation here. There's one of individual responsibility, and there's also one of collective help and aid that we help and assist one another with. So he says, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in a spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted." So our commitment to God also creates a need for us to be committed to whom? Yeah, to each other, to everybody else that's committed to God. Our relationship to the Creator puts us in fellowship with everybody else that's in fellowship with God. And let me just stop and pause for a moment and talk just briefly about that concept. Because I think sometimes we have a false concept of fellowship. And I think sometimes we think of fellowship as something that is a relationship from church to church. Am I in fellowship with that church? Or are we in fellowship with that church over there? And because of that kind of conversation, we may really miss the deeper meaning of what fellowship is about. Bottom line, fellowship is simply this: I am in relationship with God first, which then puts me in relationship with everybody else that's in relationship with God. That's fellowship. And fellowship is based on whether or not somebody is connected to God. If they're connected to God, according to the manner and means by which God has described within Scripture, then I am in fellowship with all of those folks that fit that same description. So, because of that fellowship, because of this relationship that we have one to another, we have some responsibilities as well as have some benefit and help along the way. This is a long-term commitment, and I'm going to stumble sometimes, and I'm going to need some help on occasion, and there's going to be things that I want to improve that somebody else might be able to guide me in. And so if I've slipped or I've been overtaken in a fault, then the rest of the fellowship come together and do what they can to help restore or bring me back into relationship with the Father. The writer of the material simply asks this question: and continuing my Christian commitment is a family affair. A Christian will make serious mistakes, right? Yeah, we're all going to be there. We're all going to find ourselves on the fault side, if you will, of this description. When we make serious mistakes, what should then happen? All right, so when the faults occur, then the fellowship, the body, the other spiritually minded folks come into the equation in order to help and assist in the restoration process. But it's interesting, if we're going to do that the right way, and we're going to help others in their commitment towards God in the right fashion, he qualifies this, didn't he? He said, restore such an one in what? Okay, gentleness, or what's the other word? A spirit of meekness. I like that word meekness because it gives us a deep understanding maybe of what he's really driving at. Meekness is the ability to sympathize and or empathize with others, even in this particular case, when I may not struggle with that particular problem. Have you ever seen somebody overtaken in something, well, sin or not sin, whatever you want to do, whatever, right? Put whatever thing it is, it doesn't matter. And you ask yourself, I don't understand why they have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. I don't know why they've got a problem with that. And we can find ourselves that way, right? Where we've convinced ourselves we just don't get it. We don't have any idea why this person's struggling with whatever it is, because that doesn't seem to be all that big a deal to me and a challenge for me. And when I begin to think that way, what can happen to my spirit? Yeah, I can be proud about how superior I am to that individual. What's going to happen to my spirit when I approach them? Yeah, meekness isn't going to be there. Meekness is what allows me to do that. Meekness is what allows me to, even though I may not have a problem, I may not understand why somebody else is challenged by something. It may, to me, feel like something that's an easy hurdle to overcome, but for some reason it might not be to them. And meekness is what allows me to come and help in the appropriate ways, even when I want to roll my eyes, right? Even when I want to just kind of go, really? Really? You're struggling with that? Even when maybe I want to feel that way about it, meekness tells me don't behave that way. Yeah, say it one more time, Gary. Yeah. Hypocrisy can become prevalent, which is the next point he makes in the very same verse here as it relates to that. We'll talk about that in just a second. Well, and I think humility is what leads me to be meek, if that makes sense to you. Humility is a trait or a characteristic that we have that's part of our makeup, who we are as a person. Meekness is the result. Meekness is more of an action, in other words. Humility is more of a character issue. Meekness is more of an action. How do I approach? I approach in meekness, and so in that sense, but they're hand in hand. They're highly similar. Other thoughts? So we approach in meekness, which we ought to do anyway, by the way, because we're in fellowship with one another. We're on the same road here. We've got the same goal and same purpose. We're striving to find that heavenly home someday. We're trying to accomplish the same thing in a sense here. And so there ought to be a level of meekness. But go back now to what Gary said a moment ago. Be careful that you don't come in with a haughty spirit as if you're better than other people, because if we do, what's going to happen when I fall? My fall is going to be much harder and much more difficult and much more challenging. The word pride came up a little bit ago, and you think about when we elevate ourselves too much and we condescendingly approach others about their bad behaviors and their faults and their transgressions. And then when I find myself being the one overtaken, there can be so much pride involved that I'm unwilling to make changes or do things that will benefit and aid me. And so be careful. Approach, we're here to help one another, which is really what verse 2 said, right? We're going to do what? We're going to bear one another's burdens, and in so doing, we're going to fulfill the law of Christ. Why? We talked about that already. Why should Christians help each other with struggles? Because it's what Jesus would want us to do. Remember when some folks came to Jesus and wanted to ask him, what's the greatest command of all? What did he say? You guys remember when? Okay, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. And the second is like the first, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, and so fulfill the law. Jesus wants us to appreciate that fulfilling the law, for all intents and purposes, for our thought processes and example this evening, is not simply hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. There's much more to the law of Christ than that. Those are essential elements as we walk through our relationship. I'm not downplaying their importance. What I'm saying is they aren't the end all. There's much more to fulfilling the law of Christ than just 4 or 5 things that we've created in a convenient list to make it easy to kind of talk about those things. There's lots of things involved in fulfilling the law of Christ. And one of them in particular, according to Paul as he wrote to those here in Galatia, is how we deal and treat one another and how we bear one another's burdens. I will be judged someday on how willing I was to carry a burden, a load, a responsibility that didn't belong to me. What do you think about that? In other words, it wasn't my personal problem. It wasn't my personal load to have to carry. But someday I'll stand before God, and He's not going to ask me how many times did I say, not my job. He's going to ask me, how often were you willing to pick up and bear the burdens of another? How often were you willing to carry and assist and aid, particularly in spiritual matters, and help those that you were in fellowship with? Whose burdens did you carry? Who did you aid along the way and so fulfill the law of Christ? We're in a long-term commitment here. This surrender that we're making over to God is a long journey. And along that path, we're all going to have moments where we help carry the weight for others, and there are going to be times where they help carry the weight for me. That's the kind of relationship we have with our Creator.
Human nature says, I can handle it myself.
Yeah.
I don't need anybody.
Right. Yeah. And we'll talk about that aspect here in a moment from a slightly different angle. But you're right. We struggle with the idea of allowing help in our lives. Go back to the text then. What would hinder a man? Let me ask this question. What might hinder us, and it's kind of answered in the verse, but what might hinder us from helping somebody else?
Don't want to get involved.
Okay, I don't want to get involved. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Why? I've often wondered, and by the way, I should have made this statement at the outset of studying this chapter, but what's interesting to me about this chapter is if you looked at it, you almost wonder, are we dealing with one continuous thought? Are we dealing with related thoughts? Or are we dealing with these isolated? Because it's really kind of odd. Because one minute he's talking about bearing one another's burdens, then the next minute he's going to talk about being personally accountable. Then the next minute he's going to, right? He bounces what appears to bounce from one narrative to another narrative. But I think there is a string that if we look, we'll see it being woven within this process. And so if I'm going to be willing to bear somebody else's burden, then I can't think it's beneath me. There's nothing beneath us. Okay? From the idea of what I should be willing to help somebody else with, there's nothing beneath us. Yeah. There's no work whatsoever. Nothing that I would do for another that's beneath me. And to think too highly of myself and think that I'm above certain things. And you've heard me tell you about the preacher that wouldn't help shovel snow one day, right? You remember me telling that story? He wouldn't help shovel snow because he said, I didn't learn Greek to shovel snow. Shoveling snow was beneath him. And I wonder, how effective can you be when you are classifying certain things as beneath your pay grade? As brothers and sisters in Christ, there's nothing beneath us. We ought to be willing to step up and aid and assist and help whomever, whenever they need us in relation to that. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yeah, the context is spiritual. If a man be overtaken of fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in a manner of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also. But so the context and the theme that's presented is a spiritual. So we're not talking about, right? I think that there are other narratives that talk about assisting folks when they have physical needs, right? There are other Bible passages that address that. This one is talking about how I aid and assist somebody who's been overtaken in a fault. And so I guess the next natural question then, how do you bear somebody's burden who's overtaken in a fault, right? And that's a good question. So how can I do that? Well, if they're struggling with some kind of temptation that they keep faltering under, then I can do it by encouraging them. I can do it by not creating stumbling blocks for them. If maybe the fault is a confusion about liberties, and the Bible talks about I should never use a liberty to cause my brother to stumble, and so I might. So there are ways that we can aid and assist and bear the burdens that come along, and for lack of a better description, Bob, in some ways it's messy, right? When people get involved in sinful practices, there's not going to be an easy, clean cleanup to that. Right. And again, I don't think Paul's trying to negate any other narratives. He's just trying to make a point that and somebody may absolutely decline my assistance of help. That absolutely can happen. He's not talking about whether or not they respond. He's simply talking about what I should be doing. And there are consequences to choices and decisions, and sometimes we might have to carry that a little bit for others. We may have to bear with them with that and help carry some of that challenge that's there. I think we need to be cautious that there's a level of compassion in us that doesn't just go, hey, you made your choices, right? And I'm not saying you do that. I'm just you made your choices. And I don't know that this narrative gives me the right, if you will, or in fact, I think this text is kind of telling us the exact opposite of that. To not become that. That's thinking too highly of myself. I'm better than you. I'd never make those mistakes. You go fix it. You go resolve it. You've made the horrible choices. No, my job is to help bear up under, especially when you talk about somebody who's trying to get past those faults and working. I realize there can be some folks that just push you aside. They've rejected Christ and you in that effort, and I'm not saying there's a whole lot you can do in that moment. But if they're willing to accept the help, then the best thing I can do is aid them and bear that burden, and see if we can't find a way to help them carry that along the way.
A new Christian would be that way. There's a lot of burden.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff hanging on him that's trying to control him.
Yeah. And we can't expect someone new to the gospel and new to the scriptures to understand things in the same fashion that and I think, Jim, what we do sometimes, we forget that was us once. That we kind of, in some ways, maybe we've been around so long, we think we've always known these things. But there was a point in time when we didn't. And we had to be taught and instructed. And we need to share some patience as folks overcome certain things. I still contend that we make a mistake sometimes in thinking we want to convert those who are already pure, right? It's so easier that way, right? So much easier that way if we can just if all it is them a matter of obeying some element of the gospel in there and we're done. But the truth is, you strive to take the gospel into a messy world, and you're going to get messy people who have real challenges and conflicts. And if the fellowship is condescending and thinks they're better than others, then they're going to struggle. They're going to struggle. And they're going to question whether there's a place for them in that fellowship.
And I think it's true too, Brian, that they're actually doing the best they know how.
Yeah.
And what they're seeking is reassurance.
Yeah.
Assure me that I'm on the right path.
Right. And so that's one way we can bear with them and encourage them when they're making those changes and when they're making those good decisions. So, verse 3 talks about how a man thinks about himself. Verse 4 talks about how a man actually is. Not just what he thinks of himself, but what does he act? How does he conduct himself? I think that's really what the point that Paul's trying to make here. Man thinks too highly of himself, he'll never bear anybody. He won't try to aid. He won't try to help somebody who's overtaken in a fault. It's beneath him. But a man who just wants to go about his work and honor God as best he can will recognize it's not just about the way he thinks or some superior mindset that he's created for himself, but it's also about how he goes about his own work and service to God. And it won't matter to him whether there's validation from those around him. He's not comparing himself, in other words. Generally speaking, how does somebody begin to think higher than they should about themselves?
I think they know it all.
Okay. And how do they get there? That's right. They get there because they've compared themselves to others. I'm better because I can give you a list of people who aren't as good. And Paul says, don't do that. Let every man just prove his own work. Just let every man do what he's supposed to do. And quit looking around trying to figure out who's better, who's worse, who's got more talents, or who's got lesser talents, what burdens are beneath me, what burdens am I willing to bear. Quit it, Paul says. That's not the way the fellowship of Christ works. We're not looking around trying to decide who we're better than. We're showing meekness and humility and compassion, and I'm simply going to prove my own work. It's me and how God views me, not as I view myself, not even as others view me, but am I going to accept the responsibilities that I have in my commitment to God? For every man shall bear his own burden. Now that's hard, right? Because verse 2 says what? Bear you one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Verse 5 then turns around 3 verses later. Well, depends how you count. But and says what? Yeah, bear your own burden. So which is it? Okay, so it's both. So how can it be both? Okay, so we're okay. So we're accepting accountability and responsibility. In verse 5, we're accepting responsibility for my relationship with God. And same thought. So verse 2, bear one another's. Verse 5, bear your own. If they're both right, how are they both right?
You can't take care of your own burdens. How can you help somebody else?
Okay, and so there may be some of that there.
Don't lean on other people all the time. You need to take care of yourself. Don't say, oh, please help me.
Okay.
I need help.
The word being used, like before, and what wife is there, but for is proving. So if you're bearing somebody else's burden, you're proving your work. So wouldn't that be the same?
Maybe that's part of your burden.
Okay. And I'm right now. I'm in the listening mode right now. That's all. I'm just in listening mode right now. But potentially yes. And you're right. It's an evidence of my accepting of a responsibility to help others, and in so doing, I'm bearing my own accountability of that.
Brings honor to God.
Okay. It's an effort to make sure we're glorifying God in the process.
We're responsible to God for our actions, and somebody else will be judged on what we do.
Okay. So from an accountability standpoint, ultimately I'm going to stand before God and be accountable for what I did. And in that sense, I'm going to have to bear my own burden. How else? I'm okay. So there's a sense of acceptance of this relationship that we have, and an openness to receive that help and assistance from others. I'm still trying to make sure that these don't look like two completely opposite things, because that's what they look like, right? You know, if I were trying to find a contradiction within Scripture, I might run to Galatians 6 real quick and throw two verses that are 3 verses apart from each other and say, wait a minute. One says bear one another's burden, the next one says bear your own. Which is it? We're saying both, but how can it be both at the same time? And we're getting there, I think, in our conversation. Okay, so though I may need help, and though it may be the responsibility of those I'm in fellowship with to step up and accept that role of support as one who's spiritually strong to aid and assist me. But at the end of the day, from an accountability standpoint, I'm still responsible for those things. Nobody can, though help is available, at the end of the day, I still have to own the responsibility of that. I think that's partly here. Yep. Did you have more, Ken?
We're just adding to what you're just saying. We're individually accountable for our own, or responsible for our own actions. But as we go through life, there'll be times that we'll need help with our burdens. But also there'll be times where we'll help others. And so it's that growth process as we're making that lifelong commitment. There'll be times where we need to be responsible for our own self, put the burden on our shoulder. But just like with Jesus with the cross, he needed help with it going to Calvary, and we need help, and then there'll be times where we'll help others.
Right, and so it's a reciprocal relationship that we're in. Go ahead.
We're supposed to emulate Christ. He's our pattern. How we're supposed to live. We can't go to heaven on somebody else's coattails.
Yeah.
So maybe the work that we do, how we live our life, is our burden. So we're going to face the supreme judge at the end of our days.
Yeah.
So nobody else can bear that burden for us.
Right.
If that's the burden he's talking about.
Right. So let me go back and look at this. And I appreciate all the thoughts everyone shared, but watch the movement of Paul's language here. So, first word in back verse 1. Who's he talking to? Brethren. So brethren, that's the audience. So brethren, brothers and sisters in Christ. If a man be overtaken to fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering self, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Why? For, there's the connector word. For, all of these things are true, and we should do those things in verses 1 and 2 for this reason. If a man thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. You're not better than others. You're tempted just like everybody else. You have fault. I have fault. I have burdens to bear. You have burdens to bear. You have sins that need to be repented of. I have sins. We're not better than anybody else. So get in there and aid and help and carry and assist and love. Do all those things. For you're not any better than anybody else. Don't think too highly of yourself to think that you don't and I don't have things that need to be addressed and worked on. Now what's the next word in verse 4? But. Okay? First thought, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, because all of us have weaknesses. Nobody's better than anybody else. We all need help and assistance. But, Paul says, don't think for a moment that you're not personally accountable. Just because I just challenged you to help one another doesn't change the fact that you're still personally accountable. I believe what Paul has done here is simply the same kind of writing that he did in the book of Romans. Remember the book of Romans when we studied through that even in this series? And he talked all those things about grace in chapter 5. And then what did he do in chapter 6? Yeah, he said, just in case that you're thinking that grace allows you to sin, let me just cut that thought right out of your mind right off the bat here in chapter 6 of Romans. I think he's doing the same thing. He's challenging them to embrace certain principles in verses 1 through 3. And then in his next breath, he says, but whoa here for a minute. I'm not talking about you're not personally accountable. I'm not talking about you're not having to answer to God yourself, and you're going to still have to prove your own work. Somebody talked about coattails a few minutes ago. Paul isn't saying that we can carry each other across the finish line. What he's saying is you have help, you have assistance, we need to bear up with one another, we need to be all those things. But at the end of the day, let every man prove his own work. We don't go into judgment as a collective body. We get to judgment as a collective body. We don't stand in judgment as a collective body. And so I believe he's simply contrasting two separate kinds of thoughts. One is what we do leading up to judgment, in essence. The other is about what's going to happen in that moment when I'm actually judged, and I'll have to bear my own responsibility as it relates to that. Because that seems to be. He uses those words, right? Bear one another. 4. Here's the reason why. But we're going to give you a secondary thought. It's usually what when that word "but" is used in language, that's generally what it means. I'm going to give you an alternative thought here as well, or a qualifier. Paul does that. And then he tells us why. Why? But let every man prove his own work. You can't prove each other's work. You got to prove your own work. Why? For every man ultimately is going to have to bear his own burden. Ultimately, everyone's going to have to be accountable for themselves. And that's why all of us need to embrace our own personal obligations in this process. Help is there, but personal obligation at the end of it. Thoughts or questions up to that point? Hopefully that clears that maybe a little bit. Let me go back and make sure I didn't miss anything questions-wise. Probably did. So he asked, explain how we can validate our personal spiritual significance by taking part of the credit for the commitment and service of other Christians. Really, the answer to that is why. You can't, right? You're not going to be able to take responsibility for what others have done, good or bad. And not only should we be committed to helping others with their struggles, but we should do what also? Verse 5. Bear our own what? Responsibility. And we just got done talking about why those aren't contradictory thoughts. Okay. So, in some senses, you might think, well, does Paul turn his thoughts to a completely different subject now, or is it still part of the same central kind of theme? We'll look at that here as we move forward. So he says in verse 6, let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And so Paul's basically saying you should do what for those who aid you in spiritual things? Okay, right. You should be willing to help those who communicate the word unto you, who aid you, who help you, who assist you in those spiritual matters. And he reminds them, and I don't think verse 7, sometimes we go to verse 7 and we use it to kind of make broad applications, and that's okay. In some senses, I think it does have some broad application to it, but it's said in the midst of a context. And that statement of be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever man soweth, that shall we also reap, is in the context of saying, let him that is taught communicate good things to those who are teaching. Here's a connector word, verse 8. For, so why should I do that? For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. So, if my focus of attention is only on my own personal fleshly needs, and I never communicate, I never aid or help those who are working in spiritual matters, then I'm going to only reap the corruption that comes on the other side of that. For lack of a better description, an investment in spiritual matters is an investment towards eternity. I think that's kind of what Paul's saying here. A sowing towards spiritual benefits brings eternal benefits. Sowing towards only fleshly things will only produce fleshly things that are all ultimately corruptible and ultimately are temporary and eventually will dissolve. And I want to be careful because I don't know that he's simply, here's what we could oversimplify this and just say, pay the preacher, right? We could oversimplify the text and come out of this going, that text is saying pay the preacher. It's saying far more than that. Okay? It's saying far more than that. It's saying to us, when we've been aided and benefited in spiritual matters, then it shouldn't bother us to commit fleshly, temporary, financial, whatever word you want to use, things to promote the further cause of spiritual matters. I should be investing in that as much as I should be investing in anything else. That's really what I think Paul's driving at. I should be invested in spiritual things even more so. If I'm constantly just sowing to the flesh, I'm going to reap the corruptible flesh. But if I sow to the Spirit, then I'll reap the benefits of that. He uses that phrase there in verse 7. If you go back to your question for a moment, he says, God is not mocked. What do you think he means by that? Okay. And in what way in relationship to sowing and reaping will God not be mocked? Okay. You're not going to fool God. And in some senses, if God says, if you sow to the flesh, you'll reap corruption, God is not mocked. Don't think that we can do it anyway and it not result in what God has said. God is not mocked. If God says if you sow to spiritual matters and it brings eternal benefit, God is not mocked. It will happen. And so when it comes to sowing and reaping, you're not going to be able to manipulate or change what God has said will be the result of certain behaviors and choices. Do not be deceived. Whatever you sow, that shall you also reap. And if I spend a lifetime sowing only to my personal interests and only to my personal flesh and only to the things that are interesting and to me, then I'll simply reap that and lose out on the spiritual benefits that God intends for us to have in the long run. I think that we have to be careful that we don't oversimplify this narrative to think about this solely as are we paying those who teach and preach the gospel? I think there's a much bigger picture here than that simple kind of principle. Am I sowing to spiritual things? Am I investing time, effort, energy, talents, financial, whatever it is, but am I sowing to spiritual matters? Go ahead, I'm listening.
I know a man, had cancer, was on his deathbed. A relative of his came to talk to him about his belief about right with God. And he said to the relative, he says, I don't want to have anything to do with God. And he died the next day.
Yeah.
To me, that would be mocking God.
Yeah.
He's turning these spoons up with God.
Yeah. It definitely is a form of mocking God, whether it necessarily fits this moment and what Paul's driving at here. You know what I mean? It may be a different kind of mocking than what Paul's got under consideration here, but you're right. And it's pretty scary to think. The risk, if you will, or the consequence people are willing to reap on themselves. And you're not going to be able to change the pattern of what God says you sow to and what's going to reap on the other side. So, in our last couple of minutes, so let us not be what? Weary in well-doing. For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Will you convert everyone? No. Will you convert anyone without trying? No. And does it happen instantaneously? Not always. Can it? Yeah. I've seen some folks come to an understanding of truth pretty rapidly. Maybe their background aided in that. Maybe they just had a couple of things that were confusing to them that needed to be cleared up. I've known some folks who have come pretty rapidly to the gospel. By the way, I could illustrate to you to that biblically, right? I can go to Acts 2 and show you the very first sermon that was ever preached after the fulfillment of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And you already have people being converted. Very first sermon ever that they hear. Now, did they have some background? Sure. Did they have some things that helped aid them? But it can happen quickly. But it also sometimes takes patience. And it takes sometimes a continual investment in that process.
Wouldn't you think that living a godly life is a good example for those around you would be maybe converting somebody without time?
Yeah. And we could certainly there are dozens of things we could talk about as it relates to what may aid in that conversion process. Paul's simple point here is don't become weary in that process. Don't shrink back or faint or want to quit. It's a long-term commitment. And it's not just a long-term commitment for my own personal walk, it's a long-term commitment in everything that goes in to serving God from start to finish. And so don't get weary of this process. And every time we have opportunity to do good unto all, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. And so I'm going to have opportunities to bring benefit. And by the way, I don't have nearly enough time to dive too deep into this narrative as some folks like to use Galatians 6. But let me just simply suggest to you that you consider this fact. Up through verse 10, what's the context? Spiritual or physical? Spiritual conversation. And sometimes you get to verse 10, and all of a sudden, people want to flip the conversation into a physical conversation. What we should be doing. And I think I'm not saying that it can't be part of it. What I'm saying is that's not Paul's context of thought. Paul was addressing, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual restore such. Well, that theme hasn't stopped. And he's continually to work through this. So when we have opportunities to do good, help others, be of spiritual benefit to them, sow to the Spirit. When we have those options and opportunities, let's do it. And be that to anyone who can be assisted by it, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Particularly, in other words, have interest